The air in Boston's North End smelled like candy that January, and no one thought to be afraid of it. It had smelled that way for years. A low, syrupy undertone drifting through the neighborhood on warmer days, threading itself between the salted fish and coal smoke and salt water that the harbor carried inland on the wind. Children who grew up along Commercial Street knew the smell the way they knew the smell of their mothers' kitchens. It was simply there, the way certain things in a city become simply there, unremarkable, assumed, woven so thoroughly into the ordinary that the mind stops registering it as anything at all. A sweetness in the air, a comfort, almost, a lie told so gently and for so long that an entire neighborhood had come to love it. The tank itself stood at the edge of the street like a second building, a cylinder of dark steel 50 feet tall and 90 feet wide, filled to the rim with 2.5 million gallons of raw molasses. It belonged to the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, which had been using the molasses to produce industrial alcohol, first for rum, and then, as the war had demanded it, for munitions. The war was over now. It had been over for just 14 months. The men who had come home were back at work, back at their tables, back at the business of being alive in the ordinary way. Adjust your pillow, pull the blanket a little closer. We are going somewhere very old now, and the streets are cold, and the people walking them are real, and they do not know what you know. A woman named Maria DeSteo hung laundry from a window 2 blocks away and did not look at the tank. A man named Giuseppe Antosca walked past it on his way to the rail yard, hands in his coat pockets, thinking about lunch. A cart horse named Pearl stood in the shadow of the structure, waiting patiently for her driver to finish his business, her breath rising in small clouds in the January air. These were the people of the North End, Italian immigrants mostly, working people, people who had come from somewhere old and difficult and had built something warm and loud and alive in this corner of America. The tank had been leaking for years. Small dark trickles ran down its sides in warm weather, and local children had learned to bring sticks and collect the molasses from the ground, which they ate happily without asking where it came from, or whether the ground was a place that food should come from. Neighbors had complained. Inspectors had been called. The company had painted the tank brown so the leaks would not show. On the morning of January 15th, 1919, the temperature had risen unexpectedly after weeks of bitter cold from just above 0 to over 40 degrees Fahrenheit in less than a day. Inside the tank, the molasses stirred. And somewhere in the steel, something that had been waiting a very long time began, at last, to give. There are things built carefully, and there are things built quickly, and the difference between the two is sometimes only visible at the very end. The United States Industrial Alcohol Company had ordered the tank constructed in 1915, in the particular hurry of a company that had identified an opportunity and wished to seize it before the opportunity changed its mind. The war in Europe was consuming munitions at a rate that no one had fully anticipated, and munitions required alcohol, and alcohol required molasses, and molasses required somewhere to be stored. The calculation was simple. The need was urgent. The tank would be built at Commercial Street, in the North End, beside the harbour, and it would be built fast. The man tasked with overseeing its construction was not an engineer. His name was Arthur Gell, and he was a company treasurer, a man who understood numbers in columns, profits and losses, the clean language of ledgers. He had not been trained to read blueprints. He had not been trained to assess the structural integrity of a steel cylinder 5 stories tall. He had been trained to understand what things cost and how quickly they could be made to generate a return, and in this he was very skilled. The tank was his project in the way that a signature on a document makes something yours, not through understanding, but through authority. Settle in now, let your breathing slow. We are going back to a room where decisions were made, and the room is ordinary, and that is the most important thing about it. When the tank was first filled with water to test its integrity, it leaked. This was noted. The leaks were not small. Water ran freely from the seams, and workers who were present later recalled that the sound of it was impossible to ignore, a constant whispering complaint from the steel itself, as though the structure were trying to communicate something in the only language available to it. A report was filed. The report recommended reinforcement. The reinforcement was not completed. The tank was painted instead, brown to match the molasses it would hold, and declared ready for use. A man named Isaac Gonzalez worked at the tank facility and told anyone who would listen that the structure was not safe. He said it with the directness of someone who has to walk past a thing every day and feel in his body the way it is wrong. He was not an engineer either. He was a worker. He had no credentials, no technical language with which to frame his concern. He had only his instincts, and his instincts were correct, and no one wrote his name in any official document or adjusted any blueprint in response to what he said. The walls of the tank were half as thick as the engineering drawings that eventually emerged in a courtroom would suggest they should have been. The rivets, hundreds of them, driven through the steel to hold the plates together, were too small for the load they were asked to carry. These were not the errors of malice. They were the errors of haste and of a man in a treasurer's chair reading numbers where someone trained differently might have read warnings. For 4 years the tank stood. For 4 years it held. For 4 years the neighborhood grew accustomed to the smell of it, and the children ate from the ground at its base, and the cart horses stood in its shadow, and the steel pressed outward against itself in silence. It is a particular kind of sorrow to know that something was noticed, that the right person looked at the right thing at the right time, and felt the cold certainty of wrongness settle in their chest, and then spoke and was not heard. The tank was not a mystery. It was a choice, and the choice was made in a room with a window by a man with clean hands on an ordinary afternoon that the history books never thought to record. There is a particular quality to a Tuesday morning in January in a neighborhood that does not stop moving, a low, purposeful hum that belongs entirely to people who have somewhere to be and no time to linger on the way there. The North End of Boston in 1919 was one of the most densely populated neighborhoods in the United States, which is another way of saying it was extraordinarily alive. It was a place where the streets were narrow by design and loud by nature, where the smell of bread from one window competed honestly with the smell of garlic from the next, where children ran between the legs of adults who were themselves running between obligations, and where every stoop and corner had its regular inhabitant, a man who always stood there, a woman who always sat there, a dog who had long ago claimed a particular patch of cobblestone and saw no reason to reconsider. The neighborhood had been Irish before it was Italian, and before that it had been many other things, and all of those layers were still present if you knew how to look, pressed into the old wood of the buildings, and the worn stone of the church steps, and the particular angles at which the streets met each other, having been laid down in an era when streets followed the movement of animals rather than the intentions of planners. Move a little closer now, pull the warmth around you. These streets are cold, and the people in them are about to become real to you in a way that histories rarely allow. A 10-year-old boy named Pasquale Iantosca had been sent by his mother to collect firewood from the yard near the freight house on Commercial Street. He did this most mornings before school, dragging a small wooden cart behind him, stopping occasionally to look at the harbour because he was 10 years old and the harbour was always worth looking at. He was small for his age and wore a coat that had belonged to his older brother, and was therefore slightly too large at the shoulders, and he walked with the particular self-important stride of a child who has been given a real errand and intends to complete it with distinction. A woman named Bridget Cloherty lived in a tenement house close to the tank and was at that moment standing at her stove, heating water for coffee, watching the light change on the wall in the particular slow way that winter light moves. When the morning is just beginning to declare itself, she had lived in the North End for 23 years and had raised 4 children in rooms that most people from elsewhere in the city would have considered impossibly small, and she had made of those rooms something warm enough that her children, grown now and scattered, still described them as the warmest places they had ever known. At the Engine 31 firehouse on the same street, a group of firefighters had finished the morning's duties and were settling into the comfortable middle of a Tuesday, some playing cards, some eating. One man named Bill Connor, standing at the window watching nothing in particular, with the satisfied expression of a man who has decided that this, for now, is enough. The firehouse was a place of particular camaraderie, the kind that forms between people who have seen difficult things together and have made an unspoken agreement to also enjoy the ordinary things together with equal attention. The freight house nearby was active, workers moving between the rail yard and the loading docks with the focused efficiency of men who are paid by what they move rather than by the hour. A labourer named John Callahan had brought his lunch early and was eating it sitting on a crate, his back against the freight house wall, his face turned toward the thin winter sun with the simple and complete pleasure of a man who has found, for 10 minutes, exactly the temperature he needs. No one was looking at the tank. The tank was simply there, the way it was always there, immense and brown and unremarkable, exhaling its sweetness into the air above the neighborhood, above the boy with the cart, and the woman at the stove, and the firefighter at the window, and the man with his face turned to the sun. It was 12:35 in the afternoon. The city hummed its low Tuesday hummed, and the harbor moved, and the bread smelled like bread, and somewhere above the rooftops a single pigeon crossed the January sky as though it had somewhere very specific to be, and the world was still and whole and ordinary and would remain so for exactly 5 more minutes. It began with a sound that no one who heard it ever found the right words for, and they spent the rest of their lives trying. Some said it was like a cannon, some said it was like a building falling, which is closer, but still not quite right, because a building falling is a sound with a shape. It rises and then it ends, and the ending is its own kind of punctuation. This sound did not end. It transformed. It began as something percussive and enormous, a detonation that rolled down Commercial Street and bounced off the old brick faces of the tenements and rattled every window on the harbour side of the North End. And then it became something else entirely, something low and rushing and continuous. A sound from an older world, a sound that belonged to rivers and oceans and things that move because moving is simply what they are. The tank did not crack, it exploded. The steel plates tore away from each other with a force that sent rivets through the air like bullets. And this is not a metaphor, because several of them were later found embedded in the wooden supports of the elevated railway structure nearby, driven in as cleanly as nails. A section of the tank's wall, a piece of steel weighing hundreds of pounds, was thrown across the street and into the framework of the elevated train tracks with enough force to partially collapse them. The noise of this secondary destruction was swallowed entirely by the larger noise, the way a smaller wave disappears inside a larger one. Rest here a moment. Let the weight of this settle. We are at the place in the story where the world divides, and it is important to cross it slowly. The molasses came out not as a liquid, but as a wall. This is the fact that most surprises people when they learn it for the first time, that molasses, viscous and slow in a jar on a kitchen shelf, becomes at sufficient volume and velocity something closer to concrete, something there. Tar does not flow around objects so much as consume them. The initial wave was estimated at 8 to 15 feet high and moved at approximately 35 miles an hour through the streets immediately surrounding the tank. It picked up the freight house and moved it. It demolished the supports of the elevated railway. It swept the Engine 31 firehouse partially from its foundation, folding the brick walls inward as though the building were made of paper and someone had grown impatient with its shape. Bill Connor, who had been standing at the firehouse window watching nothing in particular, was inside when the wall came. He survived. Others in the firehouse did not. Pasquale Iontoscar, the 10-year-old boy with the wooden cart, was somewhere near the freight yard when the wave reached him. He was found afterward. He was one of the 21. The molasses moved through the streets with the particular cruelty of something that does not distinguish between the cart horse and the worker, between the child and the grown man, between the person who had a moment ago been laughing and the person who had been quiet. Pearl, the cart horse, who had stood so patiently in the shadow of the tank that morning, was found in the debris, still harnessed, as though waiting for a driver who was not coming back. The elevated railway structure groaned and sagged above the street. The tracks bent into shapes that the engineers who later examined them said they had not thought steel capable of making. The cobblestones of Commercial Street disappeared entirely, submerged beneath a layer of molasses that in some places reached a depth of 3 feet. Wooden structures that had stood for decades splintered and collapsed as though they had been held together, all along by nothing more than habit and expectation. And then, with a slowness that felt almost deliberate, the wave began to spread. It fed outward from the point of rupture in all directions, filling alleys, covering steps, pressing against doors, surrounding anything it touched with a grip that tightened as it cooled. The temperature that morning, which had risen so unexpectedly from the cold of the weeks before, was still January, still far below the temperature at which molasses remains manageable. Within minutes of leaving the tank, the wave had begun to thicken, to set, to become something a person could not move through no matter how strongly they wished to. In the firehouse, in the freight yard, in the street, people were calling out. Some were calling names. Some were calling for help in languages other than English, and the languages mixed above the debris the way the neighborhood itself had always mixed, without ceremony, without translation. The boy with the cart had wanted to be home by noon. The woman at the stove had been thinking about nothing in particular. The man with his face turned to the sun had had 10 more minutes of warmth he had not yet used. It was 12:40 in the afternoon, and the city that existed at 12:39 was gone, and the city that would exist from this moment forward was not yet fully itself, and in between these two cities, in the cold brown silence of a January street, something enormous and irreversible was still slowly spreading. Disaster, when it is large enough, has a way of becoming abstract, a number, a date, a paragraph in a history book that the eye moves across without slowing. 21 dead, 150 injured, 2.5 million gallons. The figures are accurate, and they mean almost nothing. The way the distance between stars means almost nothing when expressed in miles. The mind receives the number and then quietly sets it down somewhere it will not have to look at it too often. But the wave did not move through statistics. It moved through people. It moved through a neighborhood where everyone knew the name of the baker on the corner and the name of the baker's dog, where the women on the upper floors knew each other's laundry by sight. Where the women on the upper floors knew each other's laundry by sight, where the children who ran the streets in the afternoon had organized themselves into hierarchies and alliances as complex and seriously maintained as any government. It moved through a place that was not a backdrop to the lives of the people in it, but was itself made of those lives, built from them, inseparable from them, in every important way. Come a little closer now. Let yourself be still. What we are about to walk through deserves your quietest attention. A man named Nathan Brewer was a paver working on a section of Commercial Street when the tank gave way. He was 42 years old and had come to Boston from a place he still described as home despite having left it 20 years earlier. And he had 2 daughters whose names he had given to roses in a small garden behind his building because he had wanted them to have something beautiful that would outlast the season. He was found in the debris 3 hours after the wave, alive but buried to the chest, and the workers who freed him said he did not speak while they worked, only watched their faces with an expression of such concentrated gratitude that one of them, a young man named Thomas, who had never seen anything like this before, said later that he thought of it every single day for the rest of his life. A woman named Giuseppina Deraimo had been standing in the doorway of her building when the sound reached her. She had pushed her youngest child behind her with the instinct that moves faster than thought, the instinct that does not consult the mind before acting. The child survived. Giuseppina was carried 40 feet down the street and found hours later, conscious, her hands still in the position of pushing backward, as though even in the middle of everything her body had not let go of what it was doing when the world changed. There were horses. This detail appears in nearly every first-hand account, and it appears with a particular kind of sorrow. The sorrow reserved for creatures that suffered without any capacity to understand why. The molasses caught them because they could not run in it any better than the people could, and because they were large and warm, and the substance set around warmth first. Rescue workers who arrived in the hours after the wave reported that the sounds from the horses were the sounds that stayed with them longest, the ones that returned uninvited in the years that followed. A firefighter named George Leahy was inside the firehouse when the wave struck. He was 37 years old and had worked in the North End for 11 years, long enough to have become one of those people a neighborhood builds its sense of safety around, a face that meant that things were, on balance, probably going to be all right. He died that afternoon in the collapse of the building he had worked in for more than a decade, and the other men from his house who survived him carried the particular grief of people who lost someone in a place that was supposed to be safe, which is a grief with no clean edges and nowhere natural to rest. A 12-year-old girl named Carmen Ramos had been sent to the nearby stable to bring back her father's lunch pail. She was small and quick and knew the neighborhood the way children know places, not as a map but as a series of sensations, corners that smelled a certain way, walls that were good for leaning against, roots that were faster than they looked. She found a gap between 2 collapsed structures and pressed herself into it, and stayed there for 2 hours in the dark and the sweetness, listening to the city. Tried to find itself until a voice outside called her name, and she answered and was pulled into the January air, covered head to toe in brown, shaking, unhurt, and never entirely the same. The wave did not choose, but it did not need to choose, because a neighborhood is not a collection of strangers. It is a web, and when you pull one thread, every other thread in the web registers the loss. The North End felt this in the hours after, not only in the debris and the searching and the terrible accounting, but in the silences, the corner where a specific man was no longer standing, the window where a specific light was no longer burning, the particular absence that has a shape, because the presence that preceded it had a shape, and the mind does not forget the shape of what it has grown accustomed to finding. 21 names, each of them a world, each of them already missed somewhere by someone who was walking through the brown cold of that January afternoon, calling out into the wreckage and listening, and sometimes hearing something back, and sometimes not. There is a kind of silence that follows catastrophe that is not actually silence at all, but which the mind registers as silence because it is so utterly unlike the noise that preceded it. The north end in the hour after the wave was full of sound, voices calling, structures settling, the groan of the damaged elevated railway overhead, the distant bells of emergency vehicles making their way through streets that were no longer entirely streets. And yet everyone who was there described it afterward as quiet, as a hush, as the particular stillness of a world that has just been asked to absorb something. It was not built to absorb, and has not yet decided how. The molasses was still moving. This is the detail that the first-hand accounts return to again and again with a kind of helpless bewilderment, that even after the initial wave had spent itself, even after the wall of brown had collapsed into streets and alleys and building interiors, it continued to move, slowly, with the patient, unhurried certainty of something that has all the time it needs. It crept under doorways, it found the low places in the cobblestones and filled them with the silent thoroughness of a tide coming in. It moved down toward the harbour in long dark fingers, turning the water at the edge of the wharf, a colour that witnesses said they had no name for. Let your body settle now, let your breathing find its own pace. We are moving through the aftermath, and it asks for slowness. The first to respond were the men closest to it, workers from the nearby rail yard, sailors from the USS Nantucket, a training vessel moored at the wharf whose crew heard the explosion and came running without waiting to be told to. They came in their work clothes, in their uniforms, in whatever they happened to be wearing, at 12:40 on a Tuesday afternoon, and they waded into the molasses without equipment, without preparation, guided entirely by the sounds of people who needed to be found. The substance reached their knees in places, their waists in others. It pulled at their legs with each step, extracting from them an effort that would leave many of them unable to walk properly for days afterward. They did not stop. A sailor named Robert Doyle, 19 years old, from a small town in Connecticut where nothing of this scale had ever happened and nothing of this scale would ever happen again, spent 4 hours in the molasses that afternoon pulling people free. He did not speak about it afterward with any language of heroism. He spoke about it the way people speak about the things they did because the things needed doing, and they happened to be standing there, matter-of-factly, with a slight puzzlement at the attention, as though the decision to wade into a disaster and begin working had not felt like a decision at all. The Red Cross arrived, the police arrived. A field hospital was established on the edge of the affected area, in a building that had been a warehouse that morning, and was now the closest thing to order in a neighborhood that had temporarily lost its shape. Doctors and nurses worked in coats that became brown within minutes of arrival, and the patients who were carried to them were so thoroughly covered that identification was a slow and sometimes heartbreaking process. A ring recognized, a particular way a voice said a name, a scar that someone's family member knew and had been hoping not to have to look for. The searches continued into the evening and then into the night, lit by lanterns and by the headlights of vehicles that had managed to find passable routes through the edges of the devastation. The cold that had briefly retreated that morning returned with the dark, and the molasses that had been moving all afternoon began in the lower temperatures to thicken and slow, and eventually in the deepest corners of the wreckage to set almost solid. This was, in its way, the most dangerous development, not because of what it might do next, but because of what it might be hiding. Rescue workers probing the debris with poles moved more carefully now, more slowly, listening for sounds that had grown faint and intermittent, and then, in too many places, had stopped entirely. A firefighter who survived and whose name appears in the records only as D. Donicus sat on the steps of a building 3 blocks from the tank at 9 o'clock that night and ate a piece of bread that someone had brought him and looked at his hands, which were brown, and thought about his colleague, George Leahy, who had been standing not 30 feet from him that afternoon and who was gone. He did not write about this moment. Someone who walked past him wrote about it, briefly in a letter to a relative that was discovered in an archive 70 years later. The letter describes a man sitting very still on some steps, eating bread, looking at his hands. It does not say what he was feeling, because the person writing the letter did not know, and perhaps Donahue himself did not have a word for it yet, and perhaps some things that happen to a person on a Tuesday afternoon in January require more than one night to become something that language can hold. The harbour water ran brown until morning in the tenements surrounding the disaster, in the apartments that had not been touched by the wave but had felt the explosion and watched the aftermath from windows and doorways. People sat together in their kitchens that night and spoke quietly about what they had seen and what they had heard and who they were afraid for. Children were held longer than usual before bed. Prayers were said in Italian and in English, and in the old dialects of villages that existed now only in the mouths of the people who had left them. Candles were lit. Names were spoken into the dark of rooms where the smell of molasses had found its way through every gap and crack and settled into the walls like a memory that had not yet decided whether it was a comfort or a wound. Outside, the city worked through the night, and the molasses, patient and sweet and indifferent, continued its slow and inexorable journey toward the sea. There is a certain kind of courage that announces itself with trumpets, and there is another kind that simply puts on its coat and walks toward the difficult thing without stopping to consider whether walking toward difficult things is what it does. The North End in the hours and days after the wave was full of the second kind. They came from everywhere, and they came without coordination, which is to say they came the way people come when the organizing principle is not a plan, but a need drawn by the sound, by the sight, by the simple fact of being nearby when something happened that required more hands than it had, the sailors from the Nantucket, the workers from the rail yard, the men from the firehouses that had not been destroyed. The residents of the surrounding streets who had looked out their windows and seen what had happened, and had come downstairs without entirely deciding to, pulled by something older and more reliable than decision. They came in the clothes they had been wearing at 12:40 on a Tuesday afternoon, which were not the clothes anyone would choose for wading through 3 feet of cold industrial molasses, and they waded through it anyway. Breathe slowly now. These people deserve to be seen clearly in the particular light of what they actually did. A man named Antonio di Stasio lived 2 streets away from the tank and had been eating his lunch when the explosion reached him as a vibration through the floor before it reached him as a sound through the air. He was 51 years old. A labourer who had come from a small town in the south of Italy where emergencies were handled the way all things were handled, collectively, without waiting to be asked. He was in the street within minutes, and in the molasses within minutes after that, and he worked alongside the sailors and the firefighters and the other neighbourhood men for 6 hours, and he found 2 people alive in the debris, and he carried them out on his back because carrying them on his back was the available method, and he went home that evening and ate his supper and told his wife what had happened in the careful, abbreviated way that people describe things they are still in the middle of understanding. The sailors from the USS Nantucket worked with a disguise, plying that the civilian volunteers around them found both inspiring and quietly shaming, not because the civilians were doing less, but because the sailors had a language for this, a framework, a practiced way of organizing effort in the middle of chaos that the neighborhood men did not have and were improvising in real time. A petty officer named James Dunn organized the search of the freight house debris in a systematic grid, calling out instructions in a voice that remained level throughout, and the men around him, sailors and dock workers, and a baker named Carlo Valente, who had locked his shop and come running and would not be dissuaded from helping, regardless of what anyone said to him, followed his lead with the focused efficiency of people who have been given a structure and are grateful for it. Carlo Valente deserves a moment longer than history has given him. He was 28 years old and had been in Boston for 4 years and had built his bakery from a cart to a small shop on a side street. And he had flour on his hands and flour on his coat when he arrived at the edge of the disaster and registered what he was looking at. He could not swim. He had never been trained in anything resembling rescue work. He was not a large man. He spent the rest of that afternoon and all of the evening moving debris with his hands, passing pieces of broken wood and twisted steel backward through a chain of men toward clear ground. And at one point he reached into a gap between 2 collapsed beams and closed his hand around another hand and pulled steadily and without panic until the person attached to the hand, a young woman whose name he never learned because she was taken immediately to the field hospital, came free. He walked back to his bakery at midnight and sat down on the floor of it and did not move for a long time. The rescue of the trapped and injured from the molasses was unlike any rescue operation the city had seen because the substance itself was an obstacle that did not behave like any obstacle previously encountered in the training or experience of the people dealing with it. It could not be pumped away quickly. It could not be shoveled like earth or cleared like water. It clung to everything it touched, to the legs of rescuers, to the surfaces of debris, to the bodies of the people being pulled free. And it thickened continuously as the temperature dropped, so that the work that had been merely exhausting at 2 in the afternoon became something close to physically impossible by midnight. Men who had waded freely through it in the early hours found themselves moving in slow motion by evening, burning enormous effort for each step, arriving at survivors who were, by then, encased in something closer to rubber than liquid. A doctor named John Doyle worked at the field hospital from the first hour to the last and treated injuries that the medical literature of the time had no particular category for, not burns. Not crush injuries in the traditional sense, but something in between, a combination of impact trauma and the particular damage done by a substance that had entered lungs and mouths and ears and had then begun the slow process of setting. He worked without sleep for 18 hours and at the end of it sat in a chair outside the hospital building and looked at the sky, which by then had the pale grey quality of very early morning. And a nurse who had worked beside him all night brought him coffee without being asked and sat down next to him without speaking, and they stayed there together for a few minutes in the cold, and then they went back inside. These are the people the headlines did not name, the ones whose courage was not decorated or recorded or rewarded with anything more substantial than the private knowledge of having been useful. They exist now only in the margins. A letter here, a court record there, the memory of a grandchild who heard the story once at a kitchen table and never forgot it. History has a tendency to organize itself around the large and the loud, around the names that appear most often in the most official documents, and in doing so it leaves a great silence where the most important people usually are. But they were there. On that cold brown Tuesday in the streets of the North End, they were absolutely and completely there. And the people they pulled from the wreckage knew it in the way you know the things that save you, not as information, but as something carried in the body, somewhere beneath language, for the rest of a life that would not have continued without them. There are disasters that leave a mark you can see, and there are disasters that leave a mark you can only feel, and the Great Molasses Flood of 1919 was, in the end, both of these things simultaneously. A wound in the physical fabric of the neighborhood that took weeks to repair, and something quieter and more persistent that took considerably longer, and that certain people who lived through it would tell you in their most honest moments never entirely healed at all. The cleanup began the morning after, which is to say it began before the searching was finished, because in a disaster of this scale the two things cannot wait for each other. The city deployed workers with shovels and hoses and the fire department brought saltwater pumps from the harbour, and for weeks Commercial Street was a place of organised, exhausting, largely thankless labour, the labour of undoing, which is always slower and more demoralising than the labour of making because it moves in the wrong direction, against the grain of what effort is supposed to accomplish. Let the weight of this settle round you gently. We are in the long middle of the story now, the part that happens after the dramatic moment, but carries its own particular sorrow. The molasses did not cooperate. This surprises no one who has ever dealt with molasses at domestic scale, but at the scale of 2.5 million gallons spread across several city blocks and a section of harbour, its resistance to removal became something almost philosophical, a quality of the substance that felt, to the men working to clear it, less like a physical property and more like an intention. It filled the spaces it was shoveled out of. It seeped back through the gaps in the cobblestones that had been cleaned the day before. It coated the surfaces of everything it had touched with a thin, persistent film that resisted water and required abrasive scrubbing to remove, and even then left behind a faint, tacky residue that the skin of anyone who touched those surfaces absorbed without asking permission. The harbour ran brown for months. This is not a figure of speech. The molasses that had drained from the streets into the water at the edge of the wharf distributed itself through the harbour in currents that the tides moved but could not dissipate, and the colour of the water in that section of the harbour remained visibly altered for a considerable time, a reminder, for anyone who worked on or near it, that what had happened was not yet entirely in the past, but was still, in some measurable physical sense, ongoing. Workers who spent the first weeks of the cleanup described a peculiar and disorienting experience, that the longer they worked, the more the smell seemed to intensify rather than diminish. This is consistent with what is known about molasses, which releases its sweetness more fully as it is disturbed, as it is scraped from surfaces and turned over and exposed to the air. The men with shovels were, in a sense, releasing the disaster back into the air with every stroke, breathing in the concentrated sweetness of what had happened while working to erase the physical evidence of it. Several workers reported that the smell followed them home, that their wives noticed it on their coats, that their children associated it with the particular worried expression their fathers wore in those weeks. The neighbourhood itself bore the physical evidence for longer than the official cleanup acknowledged. Dark stains on the lower sections of buildings persisted for years, a brown tide line at the height the wave had reached, visible to anyone who knew to look for it, and impossible to entirely scrub away. A woman named Rosa Champa, who lived on a street at the edge of the affected area, kept a private record of these marks, not in any official capacity, simply in a small notebook she carried in her coat pocket. Because she had decided that someone should keep track of what remained, she noted dates and locations and the gradual fading of each mark over months and then years, and her notebook, discovered among her belongings after her death in 1951, constitutes one of the most specific and human documents of the disaster's long aftermath. The people who had been injured carried their own private tide lines. A man named Silvio Corsi had been buried to the shoulders in molasses for 2 hours before being freed, and he developed in the months that followed a sensitivity to sweet smells that his family described as a kind of flinching, an involuntary physical response that arrived before thought did, before the mind had time to interpret the sensation and decide how to feel about it. He could not explain it. He did not try to. He simply avoided certain things, certain aisles in certain shops, certain pastry windows on certain streets, and his family understood without being told that this was one of the shapes his experience had taken inside him, and that the appropriate response was to accommodate it quietly and without comment. Children who had grown up eating molasses from the ground at the base of the tank a thing they had done without the slightest concern because the ground was simply where the molasses was, and sweetness was, sweetness was, sweetness regardless of its origin, could not eat the substance afterward, not immediately, and for some not ever. The flavour that had been entirely innocent became inseparable from the sound and the smell and the brown cold of that January afternoon, and the mind that had made that connection could not be argued out of it. The body remembers what the mind would prefer to set down. The old men of the North End, and there would be old men of the North End, and there would be old men of the North End decades later, who had been young men on that Tuesday, said that on the hottest days of summer, when the city baked and the pavement absorbed the sun and gave it back in waves, the smell rose from the ground again, from the cobblestones that had been cleaned and recleaned and eventually replaced, from the foundations of buildings that had been repaired and repainted and in some cases entirely rebuilt, from the earth itself which had taken the molasses in and had not, in the deepest sense, entirely let it go. They said this matter-of-factly, without drama, the way people report the persistent facts of the places they have lived long enough to know thoroughly, not as a ghost story, not as a complaint, simply as a thing that was true, not as a complaint, simply as a thing that was true, that anyone who had been there long enough would confirm that the neighbourhood carried inside itself the way a person carries a scar. Not constantly visible, not constantly felt, but present in the right conditions, rising to the surface when the weather was warm enough, and the air was still enough, and the air was still enough, and the afternoon was quiet enough to let the old things breathe. The sweet smell of a disaster that the rest of the city had largely moved on from, still rising, very faintly, from the ground. Justice, when it finally arrives, does not always look the way the people waiting for it imagined it would. It is slower than they expected, and quieter, and it arrives not in a single dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of small dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of small dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of small, careful, exhausting increments. A document filed, a witness seated, a question asked and answered, and written into a record that will outlast everyone in the room. It looks less like a thunderclap and more like a tide coming in. You do not always see it moving, but it moves. The United States Industrial Alcohol Company said from the very first day that it was not their fault. They said this with the particular confidence of a large company that has lawyers and the habit of being believed, and they said it in several directions, simultaneously, to the press, to the city, to the families of the dead, to anyone who presented them with the evidence of what their tank had done to the neighborhood that had lived in its shadow for 4 years. They suggested, with a smoothness that required considerable practice to achieve, that the tank had been destroyed not by its own inadequacy but by a bomb. Anarchists, they said, saboteurs. It was 1919, a year of labour unrest and political anxiety, a year in which the word anarchist had a particular power to redirect attention and cloud judgment, and the company deployed it with the calculated precision of people who understood exactly what it could do in a room that wanted something to be afraid of. Settle in now. Let the warmth hold you. What follows is slow, but it matters, and it is going somewhere worth going. The city of Boston and the families of the victims filed suit. 119 plaintiffs in total, representing the dead and the injured, and the owners of the property. The wave had consumed, and they did so knowing that they were entering a legal process that would be unlike anything the courts had previously handled, a case with no clear precedent, no established framework for assigning liability to a company for the failure of a structure it had built carelessly and operated negligently and then attempted to explain away with a story about bombs. The case was assigned to an auditor, not a judge, but a special master, a lawyer named Hugh Ogden, who was tasked with reviewing the evidence and producing a report that would guide the final judgment. This was a common procedure for complex civil cases at the time. but what it meant in practice was that Hugh Ogden spent the next 3 years of his life immersed in the Great Molasses Flood, reading testimony, examining engineering reports, interviewing witnesses, and constructing from these materials a picture of what had actually happened on Commercial Street on January 15th, 1919. He was a meticulous man, a quiet man by all accounts, the kind of person who does not perform his seriousness but simply inhabits it, who brings to difficult work the steady, unshowy attention that difficult work requires. He took 20,000 pages of testimony. He reviewed the structural calculations of the tank in granular detail, consulting engineers whose expertise the company's own experts attempted to discredit and whose conclusions held up regardless. He listened to workers who had noticed the leaks and the sounds. He listened to residents who had complained and been ignored. He listened to the company's representatives, who maintained throughout that the tank had been structurally sound and that the evidence pointed clearly towards sabotage, and he listened to this testimony with the same careful attention he gave to everything else, which is to say, he listened to it and then compared it against the physical and documentary evidence and found it wanting in the particular way that a well-constructed lie is always eventually found wanting, not in one dramatic moment of exposure, but in the slow accumulation of details that do not quite align. The hearings produced stories that the newspapers followed with the attention of a city that had not forgotten what it had seen and smelled and lived through. A company engineer named Harold Fay testified that the tank had been structurally adequate and was then confronted with his own private correspondence. Letters written in the months before the disaster that expressed concerns about the tank's integrity in language that was considerably less confident than his courtroom manner suggested. These letters had not been easy to obtain. The family's lawyers had fought for them document by document in the grinding, unglamorous way that the truth is usually extracted from institutions that would prefer to keep it. Not through a single heroic act, but through persistence, through showing up again and again with another request, another argument, another reason why the paper trail mattered. Arthur Gell, the company treasurer who had overseen the tank's construction without the engineering knowledge to assess what he was overseeing, testified with the bewildered air of a man who genuinely did not understand why his decisions were being examined so closely. He was not a villain in the theatrical sense. He was something more common and in some ways more troubling. A man who had been given authority over something he did not understand, and had exercised that authority in the direction of speed and economy without pausing to consider what might be living on the other side of the tank wall. His testimony revealed not malice, but a profound and consequential incuriosity, the particular blindness of someone who has learned to see numbers where other people see lives. Hugh Ogden delivered his report in 1925, 6 years after the wave. It was thorough and it was careful and it was unambiguous. The tank had failed because it was poorly designed and poorly constructed. The company had been negligent. The claim of sabotage was unsupported by any credible evidence and was rejected entirely. The plaintiffs were awarded approximately $600,000 in damages, a significant sum distributed among 119 people and the families of 21 dead, which meant that the individual amounts were modest, which meant that what the families received was not wealth, but something else, something that is harder to quantify and in some ways more important. They received, on the record, the acknowledgement that it had happened the way it had happened, that the tank had been wrong from the beginning, that the complaints had been real, that Isaac Gonzalez, the worker who had said the structure was not safe and had not been listened to, had been correct, that the children who ate from the ground at the base of the tank had been eating from the ground of a structure that the company knew was compromised and had chosen, through a combination of negligence and calculation, not to repair. that the 21 names were not an accident of fate or the work of saboteurs, but the consequence of specific decisions made by specific people in specific rooms, and that this was now a matter of public record, and that the public record would not be changed. The families of the North End had waited 6 years for this. They had waited through the company's confidence and through the lawyers' manoeuvres and through the long, slow machinery of a legal process that was not designed with their urgency in mind. They had waited the way people wait when waiting is the only available form of fighting, with a stubborn, exhausted, determined patience that does not look like strength from the outside, but is, in fact, the most demanding kind. The law had moved like molasses, but it had moved. There is a park at the edge of Boston's North End where Commercial Street meets the harbour, and on a warm summer afternoon it is an ordinary and pleasant place. A square of green in a dense city, benches where old men sit and watch the water, a patch of grass where children run without any particular destination, the harbour light coming in low and gold over the rooftops in the early evening, and lying itself down across the ground with the generous, unhurried quality of light that has nowhere else to be. There is no marker there. There was not one for a very long time. The city moved on in the way that cities move on, not by forgetting exactly, but by the slow accumulation of new things over old ones. New buildings and new businesses and new faces in the streets. New children who knew the neighborhood only as it was rather than as it had been. New layers of ordinary life pressed down over the extraordinary event until the extraordinary event became something that lived primarily in the mouths of the people who had been there and in the private notebooks of the people who had decided that someone should keep track. The tank was gone. The site was cleared. The elevated railway was repaired and ran for decades more, carrying its passengers above the spot where it had sagged and buckled and nearly come down entirely, and the passengers sat in their seats and looked at their newspapers and did not know what the ground below them remembered. Come close now. Let your eyes grow heavy. We are almost at the end, and the end is quiet, and it is yours to keep. The people who had lived through it aged in the way that people age, carrying their experience the way the die carries old injuries, not always visibly, not always painfully, but present in the particular way they moved through certain places and avoided certain others, in the way the smell of sweetness in the air on a warm day could still, decades later, produce in certain bodies a response that arrived before thought did. Maria Di Steo, who had hung laundry from a window 2 blocks away that morning and had not looked at the tank, lived to be 87 years old and told the story of that afternoon to her grandchildren, the way you tell stories that you have decided are important enough to survive you, carefully, with specific details, making sure the names were right. Pasquale Iontosca's name she always spoke last, and always quietly, and she always paused after it, in the way you pause after the name of someone who should have had more time. The neighborhood itself changed over the decades in the way that urban neighborhoods change. The population shifted. The languages spoken on the stoops shifted. The languages spoken on the stoops shifted. The shops changed their signs and their offerings and their hours. And the generations that had come from the south of Italy and built their lives in those narrow streets aged and died and were succeeded by people who had come from somewhere else and were building something new in the same small rooms. The disaster became, in the official history of the city, a curiosity, a footnote with a faintly absurd quality, the kind of historical event that people encounter and struggle to take seriously because the central element is something they associate with kitchen shelves and gingerbread, molasses. People raised their eyebrows. People laughed a little. And underneath the laugh was the thing that the laugh was covering, which was the 21 names and the 6 years in a courtroom and the brown tid line on the buildings and the smell that rose from the ground on hot days. For longer than any official account recorded, a historian named Stephen Puleo spent years reconstructing the disaster in the early years of the 21st century, interviewing the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the people who had been there, finding the documents that had been filed in archives and never examined, reading the letters and the court records and the private notebooks. And what he found was not a footnote, but a world, a complete and specific and deeply human world that had been waiting with considerable patience for someone to come looking. The people he spoke to remembered the stories, the way inherited stories are remembered, not with the vivid specificity of personal experience, but with the emotional weight of something that has been passed from one body to another across generations, losing some details and keeping others, the way rivers carry certain stones and not others shaped by what they move through. The North End today is a neighborhood that tourists visit for the food, for the narrow streets, for the particular charm of a place that has maintained something of its old character in a city that has changed enormously around it. They eat in the restaurants and walk the Paul Revere House and stand on the harbour and take photographs of the light on the water. Most of them do not know what happened here. Most of them walk across the park at the edge of Commercial Street without slowing, pass his price, without any awareness that the ground beneath their feet was once covered 3 feet deep in something that moved through the streets of this neighborhood and took 21 people from the world on a warm January afternoon, a little, more than 100 years ago. But the ground knows this is not mysticism. It is simply the nature of places that have absorbed significant events. They carry something, not in any supernatural sense, but in the very supernatural sense, but in the very literal sense that the physical world retains evidence of what has moved through it, and that the evidence, while it fades, does not entirely vanish. The molasses is gone, the tank is gone, the elevated railway is gone, the elevated railway is gone, dismantled decades ago, and the structure that bent and sagged above the wave has been replaced by a road and a park and a harbour-side walk where people jog in the mornings with the bright and summerist walk, where people jog in the mornings with the bright, purposeful expressions of people who are thinking about the future. The buildings that bore the brown tide line have been repainted many times, the cobblestones have been replaced, and still on the very hottest days of summer, when the heat comes up from the pavement and the air is still, and the afternoon has reached that particular quality of stillness that belongs only to the deepest part of a summer day, there are people in the North End, very old people now, the grandchildren of grandchildren, people who received the story as a piece of their inheritance and have carried it the way you carry the things your family decides are important enough to pass on, who say that they can smell it, not strongly, not unmistakably, but there, a sweetness in the air rising from the ground of a park beside the harbour on a hot afternoon, faint as a memory that the place has not entirely decided to release. The smell of something that happened here that was enormous and terrible and human. Neverness that involved people with names and habits and roses in small gardens and laundry on windows and children with wooden carts and men who stood at windows watching nothing in particular with the satisfied expression of someone who has decided that this, for now, is enough. The smell of a January that arrived 100 years ago and has not, in the deepest part of the ground, entirely left. Stand in that park on a hot afternoon and be still and let the air come to you, and you will be standing in the same air as Maria and Pasquale and Giuseppina and Nathan and George and Carlo and all the others, the living and the dead, the rescued and the lost, the ones who pulled people free and the ones who were pulled people free, and the ones who were pulled free and the ones who lit candles in the dark of small rooms, and spoke names into the night and waited for the city to remember what it owed them. They were here, this ground held them, and the sweetness in the air on the right kind of afternoon is the ground still saying so.